Okay, good morning, everyone. So, yep, we ready? This is the, as I said last week, just to remind everyone, this is the last series, the last one of the series, as I'm going away next week. But next week I'm starting the weekly 10-minute personal growth series on WhatsApp called Lessons from the Days of the Week. It's going to be an 8-part series. I know there's only 7 days, but don't worry. There's something beyond the days, which will be the last one. So if you haven't signed up, you can take this flyer afterwards and scan it or text me but I'll put around the link on the WhatsApps anyway, so just in case you're not, it'll come out hopefully Wednesday or Thursday each week for the next 8 weeks until we start the new series next year.
When do we start next year?
I don't remember the date of that, but I will send it around. Don't worry. Yeah. It'll be well advertised, not to worry. Hopefully 2025 is going to be even a bigger year. Okay, so just a little bit of a review from last week. Last week we dealt with the concept of everyone that has a unique purpose and a unique contribution. And we broke that down, first of all, by talking about the two ways of living, pleasure or purpose, which had to do with the godly soul and the animal soul. And we explored the whole idea of individuality from the Jewish perspective, that on the one hand, it is critically important. On the other hand, Judaism is very prescriptive and has common values and obligations and so on for every person. And the foundation is basically that if we live with purpose, then we understand that we have a common purpose, and that's the foundation. And built on that foundation and guided by that foundation, there's obviously a very important and critical contribution that every individual makes towards that common purpose, which also means that whatever we do just doesn't only affect us, but affects everyone, because it's a small piece in a big puzzle and affects everyone else's purpose. And we just said 3 things that are so important to bear in mind, and that is that our purpose doesn't always have to be huge things. It's small or big, it always makes a huge difference. Like a machine, the small screw is as critical as the big engine. Second thing is that where we land up, that's our purpose, because everything is about purpose, so therefore everything is about divine providence, and where we, doesn't mean we always have to stay in the same place, but while we're there, we have to be fully there and fully present and find the meaning and purpose there. And the last point was that whatever personality we have, that every part of us has to be guided by those principles and those values that inspire the common purpose. And therefore, if we have specific talents or land up in a particular profession or whatever it is that we're doing, we have to find the way to harness that into the context of that purpose. Okay, before we get into today, I actually wanted to I know this is just a smaller group today, but just a bit of market research, because 1 or 2 people asked me if they said they couldn't come on a Thursday, it's a bit too early for them, could we start at 9:30? Now that might not be what most people want, so I won't do it, but what do people think here, just out of... Sorry? No, that's fine, I'm just okay. You can tell me afterwards if you want. Shirley, what do you... No? Does it make a difference?
I 10 minutes.
Sorry?
I prefer
To keep it the way it is. Okay. It's very Jewish experience. Everyone. I didn't think I would get a uniform opinion. Exactly. Okay, so I have to look into it a bit more. If I don't let you know, then take it as that it's staying the way it is. Okay. So today, the book that we're working on actually has two parts to it, and the first part is what we're doing now, which is basically essentials for a healthy life or emotional well-being and so on. Then there's a whole other part too, which we didn't do, and we'll get to it sometime, maybe not on Thursday morning, maybe, which actually addresses specific challenges like discontent and worry and bad moods and self-criticism and things like that. So we will we'll get to it, but just not this term. So today I want to do the last two chapters in part one. We're going to do chapter 4 a little bit quickly, but it's important, and then go into a bit more deeply to chapter 5. So chapter 4 is called Building Healthy Habits. And we know that one of the important components of emotional health, spiritual health, well-being, contentment, and so on, there's a component that we talk about that deals with the partnership between body and soul. So the chapter begins with a story of a person who actually, I didn't know him well, but I knew who he was, and he used to visit New York sometimes. His name was Reuven Dunin. Reuven Dunin was an older chassid. It's interesting, he was born into a religious family in Israel, and then he was a very what's the word I'm looking for? A very energetic guy, and a very sort of like a chutzpahdik sort of person, always like personality, a strong person, and at a very young age left it all and just went his own way, but all along felt something was missing, and then eventually made it back, and he had this tremendous thirst to learn Torah and to be engaged in Judaism and so on, and he traveled to New York and he learned in the Rebbe's yeshiva, and he became a very big follower and a very big chassid. And this was very early on. We're talking about the 1950s, 1960s, when things were still a bit smaller. The Rebbe took a very personal interest in him, and he would often go into an audience with the Rebbe. One night, he tells the story, he entered the Rebbe's study for an audience, and he was in a very emotionally charged state. He sat down and he said to the Rebbe, I cannot take the struggles of life. I don't know what to do. I kind of want to just stay here. I don't want to do anything, like that kind of thing. And obviously he was expecting a response and expecting an explanation and some inspiration and so on. And the response that he got wasn't exactly what he expected. And the Rebbe told him, did you eat properly today? And he said, no, I didn't. Because it was all over the place, right? So he told him to go and to eat. Told him to leave his office and to go eat properly. And then when he came back, he gave him a detailed sort of guidance of what he should do to properly take care of his health, of his physical health, right? And the next few months, every time the Rebbe would like meet him in the hallway and that, he would remind him about taking care, eating properly, about sleeping. He would quote the Rambam. Maimonides actually has a whole piece on taking care of yourself, and the Maimonides says that taking care of yourself physically is a part of serving God. And he talks about eating there, he talks about, there's the Rambam's diet, and then he talks about sleeping. Do you know how much the Rambam says you're supposed to sleep?
8 hours.
He says between 6 and 8 hours, yeah. I'm a bit guilty, but anyway,
Guilty or not guilty?
I'm a bit guilty. Not that I sleep more, I just don't sleep enough. But anyway, we'll take care of that one day. But sorry?
I understand.
Yeah, it's hard. Listen, life is busy. Yeah. Anyway, he would be very. Actually, a funny story comes to mind that my father once told me. My father was a very studious yeshiva boy when he was in yeshiva. He was 5 years in New York from like 1950, late 1950 till he got married essentially, which was 5 years later, 1955. And in those years, the Rebbe had just become the Rebbe, and the boys were very close. And like, it wasn't later. When I was a student, it was very, very big, and like it was unheard of, for example, the Rebbe stop someone in the hallway and talk to them. It wasn't like that. You just, didn't have that access. But in the very early years, they would take a keen interest in the few yeshiva brachim that were there, and he would stop them sometimes. He would talk to them, and he would take an interest in their personal life and so on. So my father was a very, very studious guy, and he sat and learned all day. Later he became a businessman, but he was always a Torah scholar. And one time when he was in Yechidus, in an audience with the Rebbe, it was before the American summer, and the Rebbe said to him, you look pale, I think you should go to camp. my father always used to laugh because
Yeah.
my father in camp, like with like it's like
No way.
it's like someone dancing on Mars. You know what I'm saying? Like father, he had no interest in camp, zero interest in camp. In those days, there were very few religious summer camps. Chabad didn't even have one there. And later there came the famous Gan Yisrael. There was a different one called Torah Vadas. Just a different community. You had a camp, and people go there and take it easy and swim, and then learn part of the day. So I said to my father, "So what did you do?" He said, "Of course I went. The Rebbe said I should go. I went." Like he did it as a matter of duty. He was always listening to the Rebbe, so the Rebbe said to go. He went. But it was an interesting comment that the Rebbe said, "You look pale. You think you need some sunlight?" You know. Anyway, so this goes back to a principle. We know that there's an intrinsic connection, right, between the animal soul and the godly soul, or between the soul and the body. And it's true that we give primacy, the dominance has to be with the soul, as we've been talking about very often. But we have to harness the animal soul and harness the body for that matter. The body has to be strong. That's why there's a famous saying from one of the great Hasidic masters called the Maggid Mezrich, who said that a small hole in the body creates a very big hole in the soul, which is an interesting phrase. And the concept there is that we know that there's a relationship, and therefore in order to do what we need to do, in order to live by our values, in order to live a spiritual life, a meaningful life, a purposeful life, the tools that we have is the body at the end of the day, right? There's a saying that when the soul comes down to this world, the soul is like yearning for the time that it'll be able to do a mitzvah. A mitzvah you can't do without a body. You can't eat matzah on Pesach, you can't help another person, you can't give charity, you can't assist someone, you can't pray, nothing. You can't do anything without a body, right? So therefore, the marriage, the synthesis between the body and the soul is really, really very important. And therefore, God created in a way where the mind and the body and the soul and the emotions, everything works together. And therefore, for one to be healthy, the other one has to be healthy and has to be sort of a holistic kind of approach, right? So what does this mean? Like, what does it actually mean? So first of all, it means physically, right? We're talking about eating properly, sleeping properly. We just said before. The Rebbe writes in 1955, which I don't think medicine then had such a holistic approach, but he was always very ahead of the game and very beyond his time. The Rebbe said that now it's becoming evident. I mean, it's an old Jewish concept, and the Rambam talks about it. The Rambam says, as I said before, the Maimonides says that health and taking care of ourselves is, he calls it midarkei Hashem, it's from the ways of God. And the Rebbe says now they've discovered it scientifically that the two are related, which means that the wellness of the body is dependent on the wellness of the mind and the wellness of emotions. And it also goes the other way around, the healthier one's spirit, the greater the control in the body and the greater the ability to mend deficiencies in the body. So it actually goes both ways. That's why we have to work on both at the same time, so that both should be strong, because they affect each other, right? There was an adolescent called Moshe Levatov. Moshe Levatov was he was in Russia, and his family during the war was running from the Nazis. They had hunger, they were illness, and then his father passed away. And then his father, who was arrested, he was arrested by the communists, sent to Siberia, and then he eventually made it as a young boy to New York. And in 1951. Again, very early on in the Rebbe's journey, he had an audience with the Rebbe, and he was sharing with him his burdens, his trauma, and so on. And the Rebbe just looked at him and said, if you look better physically, you'll do better spiritually. And he told him to take care of his health, he should rest, he should eat well. He says, don't indulge in food cravings, but you should eat enough. And you should make sure to get enough sleep, all that kind of stuff. In other words, not to indulge, but to be disciplined and to eat properly. And an interesting point that the Rebbe would often make, and Judaism makes, and many sources talk about this, is that the importance of taking care of one's physical body is also driven by another concept, and that is this idea, which is contrary to the sort of common secular culture, but the idea that in Judaism we believe our body doesn't belong to us. It's on loan. In other words, it's a gift from God, right? Who we are created by God, and therefore we don't get to choose exactly what we want to do with our body, for good and for bad, right? So therefore, we're under the guidance, under the values, and part of the values of Judaism is to take care of that gift that God gave us, and therefore we're taking care of it's on loan, so to speak, right? And God wants to know at the end of our time here, did we take care of ourselves or not? Did He take care of His body that He gave us, so to speak? Okay. The second point that the Rebbe would often make is the importance of being busy. The Rebbe was a big believer in being busy. Based on a verse in Tanakh that Adam la'amal yivaled, that a person was born to toil, productivity, being busy, working hard, doing things. And he would write that productive activity, whatever that activity is, in other words, a job, a business, a volunteer, studying, raising a family, all these things that Rebbe said should never be viewed, it's an interesting idea, should never be viewed as just a capitulation to the practical demands of life. In other words, we're not here, in other words, being busy is not a necessary evil to survive. You know, never, I've got to work because I've got to make money, otherwise I'd like to be on the beach all day. But what can you do? You know, you got to. Really, my kids are a nuisance, but I got to take care of them. They mind. What should I do, right? So, I mean, let's be honest. Some of us think that sometimes, or some of us have thought that sometimes, right? When things are tough, right? Never. They mind. What should I do? No one's going to do it. But rather, his whole word. No, he says this is part of life, part of a healthy life. Obviously, there's room for entertainment, there's room for pleasure, there's room for a holiday, room for a rest. That's part of being healthy. Although the Rebbe himself didn't believe so much in taking a vacation for himself for some reason.
He didn't go to summer camp?
He never went to summer camp. From 1950, when he was in New York, when he took on when he came to New York it's fascinating, I don't know how, it was like superhuman power. He came to New York in 1941. He went in 1947. He came from Russia. I'm talking about. He was saved from the war. He was in Berlin, in France. He got caught in France in the beginning of the war. Miraculously, he was saved. Then came 1941 in the American summer. In 1947, his mother, who he hadn't seen for very long, was saved from Russia and was in France. And he went to France to pick her up. And then from then on, he actually never left New York City. Never. And he never
left the city.
He never lived in New York State, No, he did leave the city. Well, he used to go very often to his father-in-law's grave, which is in Queens. That's where he's and then he went upstate New York. No, really, he never left the greater New York City. And he never didn't come to his office. From when he started being the Rebbe in 1950, came to his office every single day. Except for 1 year where he moved his office to his home. That was the year that the Rebbe and his wife passed away, and he was davening there and saying Kaddish there. So everything sort of moved there. But yeah, he never. And one time, the furthest he went was twice when the Chabad camp started. We're talking about camp before. He was very, very encouraging of the camp starting, and he was very involved in some of the details of how it should be. And he also saw it as an opportunity to take kids who were like the whole year not in a Jewish school, and to get them to come. In summer camp in America is a very big thing. It's a huge deal. It's like a whole culture. Like they come for 9 weeks, and they started the Camp Gan Yisrael, the famous Camp Gan Yisrael, and he himself went there twice.
Where was that? The Catskills?
That was in the Catskills, yeah. And one time on the way, the car broke down and they had to wait. It was like he was delayed, like wait for an hour to get someone to fix the tire was punctured or something, right? And then one time, a couple of years later, so on the way to camp, once he said, I'm Yosef, I've covered my duty of taking a holiday, because he went for a few minutes. He went for a few minutes to the summer camp. And he walked around, he spoke to the kids, and then he came back. And one time someone said to him, you should really take a holiday. He said, I'm still trying to make up the hour that I lost when I had to fix the tire. Anyway, but that's a Rebbe. Rebbe's a different kettle of fish sometimes. Anyway, it's a different. He clearly didn't operate like normal human beings. That's evident from many, many things. But he was very encouraging of people taking care of their people being normal and not normal in an indulging way. And I think it's important to understand, right? We're not talking about self-care in the way but we've spoken about this before. Self-care in the way it's spoken about nowadays, where the whole focus becomes self-care, right? He didn't see it that way at all. He saw it as just a small part of living a life of purpose. In order to live a life of purpose, there are things that have to happen. One is you have to take care of yourself, otherwise you can't live a life of purpose. Also being productive and being busy. So he saw whatever a person does, he saw that they need to do with enthusiasm. You have to like what you're doing, you have to be involved with what you're doing, and you have to experience what you're doing, not just as a unnecessary or necessary burden or evil, or whatever the case is. And he was very, very focused. Probably, if you translate it into modern psychological terms, he was much more in the cognitive behavior therapy camp than the over psychoanalysis camp. Like, for example, there's a letter that he writes to someone, and he said, I believe the best help that you can be given to your son, obviously the son is going through challenges, and again, every case is different, obviously, and so on. In this case, he said, I believe the best help you give it to your son in general is to get him to work. Let him be busy, right? So that he'll feel something, he'll accomplish something, and so on. And thirdly, the third component of this taking care of oneself is the tremendous focus on structure, having structure. Interesting that he emphasized. I actually wasn't aware that he so focused on that, but apparently he was. And he says internal harmony is dependent on living an ordered life, like to have time for when you wake up, when you work, when you study, when you socialize. Obviously, we need to be flexible. Obviously, it doesn't always work out that way. But he was very encouraging of having that sort of structure. And he writes to someone the following, and he said, it's interesting because sometimes we're always looking for deep causes of why we're going through certain challenges, right? Again, same sort of idea, very practical. He said, reading between the lines of your letter, it appears that you assume your state of mind is the symptom of serious subconscious issues. However, in my opinion, the primary causes are the above-mentioned 2 points. Conduct in accordance with the Torah, in other words, living a purpose, and living a structured life. When you mend the above, little by little at least, your disposition will significantly improve, perhaps even becoming completely restored. So that power of sort of a preventative power, in other words, of living with values, Torah values, and also living with structure, having a time to sleep, a time to get up, and so on and so forth. Wasn't very. He didn't approve of people that just are so wild, even if they accomplished a lot, but like they eat whenever and they up nights and then sleep during. Like it wasn't. He was very encouraging of a sort of a structure thing. And the fourth concept he talks about also is, and this we know we've talked about a lot, so I'm just going to gloss over it very quickly, is the need for connection with others, social interaction. I'm not going to go into because we've done this a lot, but also very, very. And I'll just quote one letter that he wrote. He said. It's a good little phrase. He said, there's a well-known Hasidic saying attributed to several of the great Hasidic masters that it is worse to be alone in paradise than in hell together with others. In Yiddish it sounds better, by the way, but it's right. It's a Hasidic saying. Sometimes Hasidim will come up with these very sharp phrases to make a point. So and I suppose a person can I suppose what that means on the ground is that sometimes a person can have a fairly good life, but if they're lonely and alone, it's terrible. Where sometimes it'll be more challenging, but if you're with others and you're connecting to others, it's so much deeper. Okay, so that's the chapter 4. Important to mention because it really is a part and a critical component in that sort of emotional wellness and productive living. Number 5, he speaks about in chapter 5. He speaks about something which is important that we've touched upon before, but sort of brings it to a bit of a deeper level, and I want to sort of focus on that a bit. And it's about having a spiritual anchor, right? The idea of a spiritual anchor. And it's based on the following idea. So we've talked about many times the problem with people experiencing fragmentation of the mind, right? Where we are so full of inner conflict because we're pulled in so many different directions, full of doubt, lack of clarity, balancing different priorities, being pulled between temptation and values, and so on, right? And the inner turmoil that creates is really damaging for a person. And therefore, one of the things we need to always try and do and achieve is to achieve the inner calmness by creating that concept of oneness, right? And bringing it together so that there's stillness and oneness within the human experience so that we don't feel that kind of inner conflict all the time. And we've also talked about the famous analogy of the orchestra. So sometimes when you have higher values in your life, and it's like the orchestra which has so many different instruments that all sound different, and they can clash if you were to play 2 instruments at a different beat and a different tune, obviously it would sound awful, right? But when all these different instruments sounding different play to the one symphony, following the one conductor, it becomes beautiful and becomes symphonic and it's harmonious and so on. So that is true, but I want to just take it a little bit deeper and look at something that the Rebbe does cover and understands, right? He says like this. I just want to quote you a letter that he says. He He says, in 1965 he wrote this, he says, this is also being confirmed by modern science, he says, that a surface layer may cover up an essential trait or quality, right? Or to use the modern terminology, what was modern in 1965 at least, the subconscious may be overlaid by the conscious mind. In such a case, conflicts are inevitable. In other words, like this, the conflict is not just a conscious conflict that we don't know what to do. Should we take a vacation, or I don't know, or take care of someone? Should we volunteer or take more time for myself? All these things also create a lot of conflict, right? Create boundaries, I don't know, with the relatives that are getting on my nerves, or not. All those kind of things. Those are sort of conscious questions. But he says much deeper than that. There's often a conflict between our conscious self and our subconscious self, right? And he says, in such a case, conflicts are inevitable. For man's essence is linked to the deep internal layers and not the superficial cover, which is subject to change and is under the influence of external forces. In other words, what he was promoting was this concept that inner conflict and that turmoil that we have is actually created by the conscious layer of our experience, right? And it comes from the lack of connecting to the subconscious. Because he says like this, and I'm just going to quote some more. He says, our conscious selves are vulnerable to transient influences. As we all know from personal experience, our opinions and behaviors often change because of new circumstances or societal pressures. The malleable version of ourselves can hardly be called who we really are. But our inner subconscious selves are different. They remain inherently unmoved by the outer world. And this is the point this is the point that we're going to focus on, right? In other words, that there's a huge difference between our conscious and our subconscious. Part of the difference is that our conscious layer is so susceptible to change due to the influences from the outside world and the differences between our own circumstances, which change. And as they change, so does our conscious self change. We all know this. You move to another country, or you're in a different relationship, or a business situation is different, or just age is different. Everything, right? Things happen in the world affect us so badly and or positively, whatever the case is. And a lot of that has to do with the fact what is changing, what's calm one day and anxious the next day and depressed the other day and happy the third day. It's all our conscious self, right? What doesn't change, he says, is our subconscious. But we need to understand what that subconscious is, right? Because when we talk about our subconscious, obviously, it's getting a bit warm in here, isn't it? Yeah?
No.
Yeah.
No,
Can we turn on just for a few minutes? Yeah. Just that up right hand, just for a few minutes, and we'll turn it off. Yeah, it's great. Okay. Starts to get a bit cool, we'll turn it off. Okay. I have to stop. Did I ever tell you my story with the air conditioning and politics? Oh. So when we first started the shul up at the Bellevue Hill, we used to have the shtibel. It was very, very beautiful. And there was a like everyone got on, and it was just beautiful. Yeah, oh, it's always nice. And there was a guy that used to come once a year. He'd come on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. He didn't belong to it, but he would fall in and anyway, then he went through his own life challenges, and he was alone. He was separated, whatever. And he always used to cause problems on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. He was always one that got really angry. The air conditioning is unhealthy, and I'd forgotten about that. Anyway, one day he called me, and I hadn't seen him for quite a while, and he'd lost a relative, and he wanted me to do the funeral. Anyway, I ended up being in the car with him, just alone, me and him, for a long drive. And he was talking about the shul, and we were having a conversation. And he asked me, how's the shul going? And he asked me, does the shul have any politics like other shuls? He says, sometimes shuls, communities have politics, people don't get on. I said, actually, no, and it's really, really beautiful. Everyone's getting on. And I totally forgot who I was talking to. And I put my foot in my mouth, and I said, the only politics we have is the air conditioning. And I thought, oi, what did I just say? Anyway, so we'll try to keep the peace. Anyway, he was still spoke to me afterwards, but it was all right. Anyway, so when we talk about the subconscious self, right? When we talk about the subconscious self, so obviously it depends how you define that, right? And can it be reconciled with the conscious self? How does that work? So Freud, right, as we know, had a very different view of the subconscious self than Judaism does, obviously, right? He believed the subconscious, the inner essence of the person, the subconscious of the person, is pleasure, right? Pursuit of pleasure and a sexual drive. That's what he believed there was. Which, in his conception, therefore, there was a problem, right? Because he said that these insatiable desires or drives that a person has and the norms of society, which need to be reconciled, he believed creates an inevitable tension, right? At the center of the human experience, there's a good line that he puts in the book here. He says that can only be managed but never reconciled, right? Which is fascinating. Because he holds that, because he believed that's the person. So he believed there was a problem, right? The person was at the core a sexual animal and a person who just wants to pursue pleasure. Society has to function, so therefore we have that referee, the conscious mind, I forgot what he called it, the id, I think, right? In order to navigate and referee that tension, but those tensions never go away, and there's always going to be there, can be managed and not reconciled. Now we also have tension that goes on all the time, that's true, between the two souls, but what's different in Judaism is that we have one part of us that is actually, when we understand it or we connect to it, does reconcile, at least conceptually in our minds. Not that the hard work will disappear, but at least we understand who the real us is, and the real us actually can reconcile the tension, not just manage it. What do we mean? So the Rebbe would always base this on a very, very famous passage from Maimonides, the Rambam, right? And it's actually in a very interesting place. It's written in the Rambam. Maimonides wrote many, many books. I don't know if you know that. So one of his magnum opus was called Mishnah Torah, which is actually a halachic book. It was 14 volumes of all gathered of all the halachot of the Talmud, very beautifully organized and clearly articulated and so on. And then he wrote many philosophical books and Guide to the Perplexed and many letters and so on and so forth. So in his halachic work, funnily enough, there are certain, he talks about a certain case based on the Talmud where a person is obligated to do certain things but doesn't want to do it, right? One of them is, for example, certain cases that a man is obligated to give a get to his wife, right? And we know sometimes the problem with not wanting to do it is that it's actually very hard to force the person to do it because halachically it needs to be done willingly, right? The person has to do it willingly. There's also the same thing happens in certain laws of sacrifices, which we don't have today, but there's certain things that need to be done. So the Rambam, based on the Talmud, says that when halachically it's required, when it can be established that it's been a long time, or there's certain circumstances that determine that halachically it's important for the person to do it, the Beit Din, the court of law, can apply coercion. They can coerce him to do it, right? Says Maimonides, hold on a second. What do you mean you can coerce them? It has to be done willingly. He says, no problem, you coerce him until he says, I want. He said, come on, who's playing games here, right? What do you mean you coerce him until he says he wants? He's only doing it because you're coercing him, right? By the way, that's still applied today, not in other countries besides Israel, but in Israel where it has been applied, where the Rabbanut has jurisdiction over marriage and divorce. There's been cases where there's been women who are in Aguna, and the Rabbanut there, the rabbinate there, has the power to put the husband in jail, and it's been done. Now you have certain crackpots that would rather stay in jail for 15 years and as long as he knows that he's torturing his wife, right? I mean that's a mental assault, obviously, but most people would prefer not to be in jail. So maybe that's a sort of an incentive where they end up doing it, right? Or certain prenup case or agreements. All these things are dealt with in halachic sources. But the question is, what did you accomplish? The person not doing it willingly, he's doing it because he wants to get you off his head, right? So the Rambam says the following. Every Jew, says, I'm going to quote, every Jew, says the Rambam, regardless of his status and station, is essentially willing to do all that he is commanded to do. However, sometimes the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which is the superficial part of the person, prevails over his better judgment and prevents him from doing what he has to do in accordance with the Torah ruling. When therefore the Beit Din compels him to do it, it is not within a view to creating him a new desire, but rather to release him from the compulsion which has paralyzed his true desire, thus enabling him to express his true self. Under these circumstances, when he declares, I am willing, it is an authentic declaration. It's a very fascinating concept. In other words, the Rambam is saying, now obviously, we're not talking about therefore it's a good idea to go and coerce people to do the right things every part of their life, right? Because that's not very effective. But there are cases where it affects other people, and therefore coercion is maybe appropriate. But the question is, how does that fit in to the halachic requirement of it being done willingly? And he says because the default position of the godly soul, which is your true essence, your true subconscious. It's not what Freud said. It's much more of a spiritual, meaning-seeking, moral foundation. That's what your subconscious is, right? That's your true self. Wants to do the right thing. But we are blocked by layers of compulsion, which come from our egocentric layers, conscious layers, whatever the case is, which are all much more superficial than our true self. And therefore the default position of a true person, right, is to do what God wants him to do the right thing. And therefore, it's such a powerful concept. It's not just a philosophical nice idea that's good for a good drasha, but it's applied halachically. That in cases where something must be done willingly, the person has to get it done and doesn't want to do it, it's okay for the court of law to impose coercion just to reveal his true desire. And when he says, Rotzeh ani, I want to do this, it's not because he just wants to get the basting off his back, it's because he really wants it. It's an authentic thing. It's not hypocritical. So it's an amazing concept, right? Interesting enough, I just studied something last week, actually a talk of the Rebbe. I tried to do one talk every week, like a long essay, and one I hadn't done before. The Rebbe addresses a famous midrash, which I knew as a child. I learned it in kindergarten, but I always wondered about it. Famous midrash, you know that Avraham Avinu we know two things about him. He was extremely, our father Abraham, he was extremely hospitable, and also he made it a mission of his to bring people closer to God and to believe in the one God, monotheism, right? He was the spreader of monotheism and inspired thousands of people, the Midrash tells us. One of the ways he did that was he combined both. He used to invite people who were in the desert that didn't have where to eat, and he was like the local inn and local hotel where you can come in and you could find a drink and find a meal where there was nothing else available. And he would talk to them, and then he would suggest to them afterwards, maybe you want to thank God for the food. And he would start talking to them about believing in God, where the food comes from. And some of them would resist. And he would kind of hint to the fact that, well, then maybe there's no discount. I mean, finding food in the desert is like an expensive proposition. So, there's a full price here. And then often they would then reconsider, then engage in discussion, and he would win them over. And the Rebbe asks this question. He says, that's a really strange way to get someone to engage in belief in monotheism. And the Rebbe takes this Rambam and applies the same principle. Even before the Torah was given, and even to non-Jews, there is actually the default of every human being. Okay, with Jews there's a specific role, a specific godly soul that we have that's related to the Torah value specifically. But it's a universal thing. Every person is created in the image of God, and every person has what we call the 7 Noachide laws. Every person has basic morals and values that even the Torah tells us that we're supposed to spread and teach to humankind in general, and to encourage people to live by those values, to populate a ethical and moral society. And therefore, the default subconscious of every human being is to do the right thing. And Avraham Avinu even, obviously, eventually it wasn't by force, it wasn't just that, it was actually people did engage and they were inspired. But to just nudge them on a little bit, he kind of peeled the layer sometimes, right? Because he would give it for free normally, but this would inspire people to maybe reconsider, and that was a way to get to their true self, right? Obviously, in every case, this is different, and one has to do it in a different way, but just the principle is there, that every human being actually at its core, or his or her core, actually wants to connect to something much higher, and wants to be moral and ethical, and has clarity of what that means. That's what every human being is. That's the default of every person. Tension becomes, therefore, right? Tension is created when our conscious is not connecting with our subconscious. Now, of course, as you heard me say 1,000 times, this became post-Freud very, very common in modern psychology, but specifically post-Freud, which was from Viktor Frankl and even Jung, who were both students of Freud, who then deviated from Freud's proposition, right? And therefore talked about the concept, and in their terminology, that everyone has a desire for purpose and meaning that comes from a subconscious desire and a subconscious need, right? Interestingly enough, Jung writes about this, and Viktor Frankl talks about this as well. I found a very interesting. He made reference in the footnotes of the book, and I've never seen this. I once quoted to you a video that I saw of Viktor Frankl. It was the only lecture that's on YouTube. What I didn't realize until a few days ago was that actually there's a bunch of interviews with Viktor Frankl on YouTube. It's fascinating. Because it's fascinating to hear him talk. It's actually very, very fascinating.
Fascinating to read.
To hear it, yeah, to read him also, but I'm saying also when you hear him talk about it, it's actually it's like a different level. That's also, I guess, for me, I'm much more of an auditory person in a way, so it's lovely when you hear the person saying it, right? So interestingly enough, in an interview, someone, I don't know who it is, funnily enough, she has a South African accent, but fun point. But anyway, she asks him, she says, so Dr. Frankl, what is a life of meaning? What does that mean? Right? The whole logotherapy is based on that every person has a desire to live a life of meaning, to go beyond oneself, live for something higher. What is that? What is a life of meaning? So interestingly enough, and I don't know if it's so clear in his book, but he starts off by saying the same thing. Essentially what he's saying is really, I think, is that you can't just be completely self-absorbed. You've got to go outside of yourself, right? But he starts very simply. He says it could be, he lists 3 things, and then he gets to something deeper than that. He says it could be just about what he calls creating a deed or experiencing work. In other words, like Tal Ben Shachar once shared with you, talks about that even when one has a job, a regular job, it's about finding meaning in that job, finding purpose, right? You know, I had this experience, I was reminded of this just a couple of weeks ago when my wife Dina was in hospital for a couple of days. She's fine, thank God, and she had to take a chest x-ray and someone came to get it, and it was an amazing thing. The guy had a job. His job was to wheel people back and forth to the x-raying department of the hospital. And he was the most wonderful human being. I could see he was very similar to the story that I told you when we did Tal Ben Shachar about purpose. And he said about the different people building a big cathedral when they were asked, right? The one said, I'm laying bricks. The other one said, I'm building a building. And the third one said, I'm building a house of God, right? And the similar thing in people that work in a hospital. You cannot have a hospital without someone to wheel the patients to the x-ray room. You cannot have a hospital without cleaners. The question is how they see it. Do they see it as just a job because I've got to pay the bills and I can't do anything else, or they see it as purpose? This guy I met is the most beautiful human being. He knew a lot about Judaism because he had a lot of friends that were Jewish. It's very funny. He's gone to Shabbos tables and all that. But just you could see his love, and it was a purpose for him, helping people get better. And it's amazing. So that's one way of finding purpose and meaning. It's just to experience work. He said the second way is experiencing love. He said love is very much about meaning. And I think what he means by that is because with love comes relationships. In other words, it's going beyond yourself. You connect with something higher. You're not just about you. You're about spreading to others, about loving others. I think it's pretty obvious. He's not talking about selfish love. He's talking about selfless love, right? Loving people, helping people, and so on. And then he says also an interesting thing. He says that even in challenging times, this is all in the YouTube video, you can check it out, right? He says there are people that when they challenge, they can squeeze out meaning by advancing an attitude. So sometimes meaning comes from a perspective in challenging times. You go through a challenge and you work to change your perspective. Again, all the same thing, moving out of yourself really, out of your self-absorption. And then the question is, he says, the interviewer asks him, he says, what's your view on religion? How does religion fall into the concept of meaning? And he says the following. He said, this is a quote from the video. He says, man, or a large essential part of the human population, goes one step beyond and strives for an ultimate meaning. A religious individual, he's not talking about Judaism necessarily, he's just talking about religion in general, right? A religious individual is not satisfied only with finding a meaningful task to complete. He or she goes a step further to also include the awareness of the task giver, which is divinity. And that's a deeper form of meaning. Right? So it's not just about doing the task, it's about connecting to the one who gave the task, which is divinity, and following the moral compass and connecting to something completely higher, not just than yourself or other than yourself, but connecting higher than the human altogether, which of course is God, right? And that's the ultimate form of meaning. And of course Judaism obviously ascribes to that form of meaning, and that's the concept of engaging in the values and the practices and the belief and the perspectives that the Torah provides for us in the moral compass. So that's the concept. The concept is therefore, just before we go further, that emotional wellness, creating less of a conflict within ourselves, means going to the depth of who we are and discovering our true self. Our true self is that layer within ourselves that is pure, that layer within ourselves that doesn't have conflict, because that layer within ourselves is the part of ourselves that has clarity, because that's the part that provides us with the pursuit of meaning, purpose, values, morality, and connection to God. And therefore that becomes the foundation. And if we connect to that part, it's like, going back to the analogy, it's like all the instruments then connecting to the conductor of the orchestra, and therefore conflict falls away. So therefore a very, very deep recommendation of creating, even on a very selfish level in a way, I need to use the word selfish here, but on a selfish level, to create that concept of inner calmness and emotional wellness, it's about finding that spiritual anchor. Every person has to find that spiritual anchor. What's driving me? What am I filling that need to live a life of purpose and meaning? Am I connecting to my true self and my true clarity? And then and then there's another whole layer to this. And this is the following. He says, it's not enough to have meaning, right? It's not enough to believe in meaning. It's not enough to connect to something deeper within our perspective, but we have to apply that meaning. And this is where the Rebbe particularly, I mean Judaism in general, but Rebbe particularly was so encouraging of and taught so much of, and that is the power of a deed, the power of action, right? Which is and that's in other words like this, when you have a concept of meaning, right? A pursuit of meaning, a higher value, a higher purpose, sometimes it can remain in the conceptual, it can remain in the theory. But the idea of then translating it and that inspiring an action, not only because the action is important, but the action is powerful, right? And that's the idea behind what Judaism refers to as a mitzvah. When we do a mitzvah, whether it's a mitzvah between man and man, by helping someone or giving tzedakah or assisting and supporting someone, or whether it's a mitzvah which is a spiritual thing, like lighting a Shabbos candle or mezuzah or a kiddush or tefillin, whatever the case is, right? That power of taking the clarity of our true self and then translating it into actual deed has an amazing power to then bring us to a state of synthesis and harmony within our experience. Because what we're doing, you see, action, he doesn't explain this here, but he explains that many other places. Action is sort of the lowest form of our experiences, right? So the way the structure of the human being is, we have our subconscious, and we have our very deep subconscious, which is our soul. That's where the pursuit of meaning comes. And then we have our egocentric subconscious, and then we have our cognition, our emotion, and then we have our behavior. We have thought, speech, and action. So in other words, the bottom rung of the ladder is action, right? And we are taught in Kabbalah that the two connect with each other. Because there's a phrase in Kabbalah, na'utz tchilatan b'sofan, which means the head, the top, is always connected to the end. Where is the highest level of anything expressed in the most powerful way? If it can influence the lowest form of existence. In other words, if we can take that deep, deep subconscious that we have, our true self, our desire to live that life, and express it, at least in some way, or with constant growth, but not everything at once necessarily, but in some way, to a deed, so we're connecting the highest with the lowest, and that creates the inner harmony. And that creates an amazing synthesis and harmony within all the different components and different parts of our existence. By the way, that's true on an individual level, it's true on a collective level. I don't know, I'm sure many of you are aware that I was listening to a speech, and just an amazing thing of channeling, right? Channeling these beliefs and channeling faith into sort of something tangible and tangibility in general. So I heard a speech by the funeral. There was a rabbi killed in the UAE this week. I'm sure you were aware, right? A Chabad emissary that was kidnapped and murdered by 3 terrorists in Israeli. His name is Rabbi Tzvi Kogan. And eventually his body was taken to Israel, and there was this massive funeral. And the head of the Chabad network in the UAE now, the Rabbi Duchman, he spoke and others spoke, and he made this amazing declaration, right? He said, which is really typically the Jewish response. It just took a lot of strength at that moment to say it. Obviously everyone was very devastated and broken. He happens to be related to that person who was murdered also, and so on and so forth. And he said, obviously the Jewish response is that we will never give up, and we're not going to give up, we're going to continue. And in fact, the government there is actually working with him. And he made a declaration on the spot. He said, we believe everything's from God, and it's painful and we're broken, but we're not going to give up. And he announced that they're going to be building a huge building there. a huge building in Abu Dhabi where it's going to be an amazing Jewish center of, a lot of Jews going through UAE these days and kashrut and just place to learn and be inspired and tefillin and so on and so on. Action. We got to respond with action. In other words, when things happen that are challenging, of course we have faith, and we've talked about faith a lot. We've got to channel that faith and then translate it as something tangible. Where is our faith expressing itself? What am I doing this week that my faith should actually have some sort of tangible hold on something? Just to end off, this power of an action is so strong. I want to share with you something that is amazing, actually, the way the perspective. I found it amazing, anyways. So in 1980, there was a major conference in America of the Jewish community on issues and needs of Jewish, what they called then, it wasn't a bad word then because that's the language they used, but the Jewish retarded, right? Which was the standard language at the time. By the way, at that time, the Rebbe already rejected that language. It was way back. And he said, because he added in brackets in a letter, he said, with regard to Jewish retarded, and then he puts parenthetically, I prefer some such term as special people rather than retarded. Well, yeah, later special needs became a big thing, but it was already there that he said that he didn't like that language. And he sent a letter to this conference, and he encouraged them. Now, it's interesting, just as a preface, before we say what he said, when we talk about Jewish obligations, right, halachic obligations of a person, in terms of keeping mitzvot and doing different things or not doing certain things and so on, in Jewish law there are certain people who don't have a responsibility to keep Jewish law. One of them are people with a cognitive special needs, right? People who don't have the cognitive ability that actually are absolved on a halachic level. They're absolved from making kiddush or shaking a lulav or whatever the case. They don't have to do that, right? And yet the Rebbe encouraged the following. He said, the actual practice of mitzvot in everyday life provides a tangible way by which these special people of all ages can, despite their handicap, identify with their families and with other fellow Jews in their surroundings and generally keep in touch with reality. Then he says, even if mentally they may not fully grasp the meaning of these rituals, subconsciously they are bound to feel at home in such an environment. And in many cases, they can participate in such activity even on a conscious level, right? And he goes on to explain the following. He says that he said that he's tried it himself, because in the early 50s, 60s, the Rebbe came up with this campaign of going around, UCB do this, right? And a lot of people do it, right? Of going around on Sukkot, for example, and giving people the opportunity to do the mitzvah of lulav. And he said he specifically then, when he launched the campaign, he told people to go to nursing homes and hospitals and places where there were many people who consciously couldn't do that, didn't understand what they were doing necessarily or fully understand. And he said, all the more reason to reach out to them in this tangible way. And he said like this, it says that the reports were profoundly gratifying. Doctors and nurses were astonished to see such a transformation. People who had spent countless days in silent immobility, deeply depressed and oblivious to everything around them, the moment they saw a young man walking with a lulav and etrog, suddenly displayed a keen interest and eagerly grasped the mitzvah objects, some of them reciting even the blessings and so on and so forth. And he goes on to explain that it was apparent that they suddenly felt comfortable in that surrounding, because that's who they really are. And I was reading this and I was thinking of an amazing video I saw once, where someone comes to the Rebbe, quite a famously, I don't know if you've heard the name, Chazan Malavani. He was quite a big Jewish Chazan. And he came to the Rebbe and he said that he has a child in England who's severely autistic, and he doesn't interact with people, and he doesn't very, very sort of not high functioning at all. And he asked the Rebbe just a bit of advice and sort of guidance, and the Rebbe told him an interesting thing. The Rebbe said that they say about such children, I don't know what it was based on, but he said they say about such children that they cannot communicate with God, with people, but they do communicate with God. And therefore encouraged him to put a tzedakah box in his room, and he should give tzedakah, and they should do certain mitzvot with him. And at a later stage, he comes back and reports to the Rebbe that it was amazing. Suddenly, like his child perked up, and like every time he would love to do these things, because that's the true self of a person. And sometimes someone who's actually damaged on the conscious level in an absurd way actually connects more deeply with the subconscious and with their real self. But it's a tangible thing. It was like seeing. It was like an amazing thing, right? So therefore, I'm just bringing this out again as a power. It's just not a ritual. It's not a cultural thing. It's an energy. It's a power. It's a connection. It's a tangible connection to the values and the morality and the belief system and the faith that really lies at the very depth of our subconscious. So in conclusion, what the Rebbe is saying is the following. The first chapter we learned today, obviously we need to take care of our physical needs and physical body and structure and being busy and so on, taking care of our physical self. That's so important. On the other hand, also, what's really important to create calmness in our life, besides the spiritual meaning and the service of God that's involved in it, but also just from a practical level to create, everyone in their own way maybe, but to create a real spiritual anchor. Something that they connect to who they really are, which then creates harmony within all different components of their experience. So that's it for this time. Remember, so we not have, this is it. We will start the series next week on WhatsApp, the 10-minute protocol series on lessons of days of the week, and be in touch of all the things that will happen over the summer and next year, of course. Thank you so much.
The piano tuner eventually come and tune the piano.